Hello and welcome to Hawksong Weaving. My name is Took. I'm a disabled genderqueer weaver who works exclusively with thrifted and secondhand yarn, and today I'll be weaving a blanket with a family joke behind it and taking a stab at blanket binding for the first time. I hope you enjoy.
Life takes odd turns, but even tattered and worn yarn still has value. Tired joints and health flares don't have to stop the journey. Welcome to Hawksong Weaving, where all our paths are a little bit warped.
For this blanket project, I fully admit I was so excited about the sheer amount of yarn goodness that I jumped the gun on weaving. So I don't have footage of the first fourth of this shawl, but here we go for the fifth weaving blank. A side note that I call these panels weaving blanks because they're going to be turned into other things and they are a blank template for possibility for sewing. All of these yarns are a variety of acrylic yarn that I thrifted from the Goodwill in my town. I shifted the design of this blanket a few times in relation to how much yarn I had remaining from this particular color batch, and that's part of why I love working with thrift store yarn. Pretty much everyone is struggling right now, so reminding myself that I can adapt and make do temporarily relieves some of that economic existential horror. If you're curious about the adaptive warping method I'm using, feel free to check out the link in the corner. I have hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and with that comes a lot of joint hypermobility and chronic pain, so this is the warping method that I've adapted to suit my needs. I found that most traditional warping pegboards were too heavy on my arms and my wallet, so instead I use a small accordion coat rack. I keep it pinned with the warping peg and the loom, and from experience I know what pegs to warp to get the length I want for a specific project. This is what works for me. It won't work for everyone, and that's okay. Weaving has a long history, and while it's important to honor that when you can, it's just as important to not be in pain while you craft. You matter too. With the warp threads sorted, I'm lifting up the loom to release the warping board from the loom, gathering the warp threads into one large bundle and using the back of my neck to drape them over and keep them tidy and out of the way, while I collapse the warping board and get it tucked out of the way until I'm at a full pause point where I can get it unclamped from my desk. I use terry cloth towels to cushion the warp threads. This helps prevent the finished weaving from being tighter at the ends and looser in the middle, creating a sort of sausage profile in the weaving. The way that I warp has me cutting the warp loops at the end of winding the warp. This is what's easiest on my body. It won't work for everyone, but that's okay. This is as good as an angle as I can get, and I'm being careful to pay attention to how the warp threads are laying on the back bar of the loom. The right hand thread goes through the smaller hole in the rigid heddle reed. It's not critical, and some minor mistakes aren't the end of the world, but it does make it easier to keep the tension of the warp threads even across the entire weaving. Attaching the warp to the bottom apron bar is pretty easy. I finger comb it, get it separated into bits about 4 to 5 warp threads wide, separate these bits into 2, and then do a half hitch tie to the apron bar. Before I get too far into this, I'd like to thank you for watching. If you'd like to support my work, some free ways to do that are to like, subscribe or follow, share, and of course comment. This applies to other small artists as well. It's a great way to let the social media algorithms know that this is content worth watching. If you'd like to support me financially, per viewer request, there's a Buy Me a Coffee linked below, along with the link to the Hawksong Weaving Square site where you can purchase unique woven products. I also now have a Patreon that's linked below as well. There are currently 4 actual tiers and 1 very silly tier. These tiers include early access to videos, a weekly post of Life of the HR and Osha Cat's Kavechi Diary, being able to vote on projects, and fun snail mail. The 5th tier is absolutely a joke, but just in case in this economy, I won't say no. For $1,000 a month, you can tell me that I'm not actually disabled, I'm just lazy to try whatever yoga, juice cleanse, snake oil nonsense to fix your cousin. In my last video, where I was making a shawl, people asked how I made sure that the panels were the same length, and the short answer is I wing it. The longer answer is, due to my hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, I'm effectively dyslexic. Essentially, my eyes are hypermobile, and that causes problems with reading, especially with numbers. Math is incredibly difficult for me because the numbers jump around and don't follow patterns like words do. I can pattern recognize words when I'm having a hard time with my eyes not cooperating, but numbers don't have that pattern for the math I'd be doing for weaving. So I guesstimate, and I keep track of how much spring the yarn has and use my loom as a measuring tool. And usually I'm careful to only use wool blends that will steam block more effectively for larger projects like this. Since I'm doing this blanket with only acrylic yarn, I'm binding the hems because I don't want to spend my time ramming my brain against my disabilities. I'd much rather spend my time and energy on actually weaving and sewing. Now tying off the panel fringes, because I'm not bothering to measure these panels, I'm just doing a sliding knot. The ends will be bound anyways. To avoid loose ends, I weave the sewing yarn into the actual fabric. I'll tie a knot at the very end of it, but I find that weaving in the loose ends helps to keep things tidy. I started fiber arts with knitting, so this was a fairly easy step for me to take. The way that I sew these panels together that I found works best is to hook the needle through the weft loop of the selvage, or the edge of the panel, and the outermost warp thread at the same time, and to do a whip stitch diagonally from each panel all the way up. So, the funny story behind this blanket. My biological parents weren't married, and honestly, thank every whim of the universe for that. But to summarize things, my older half-sisters get more joy and schadenfreude out of my being transmasc than I do, because the jerk kept trying and failing to have an assigned as male at birth child. He is the epitome of the alt-right leaning toxic Thor bro. The type that gives Norse pagans a bad name and make the rest of us have to work doubly hard to repair the damage they're doing to others and our community. None of us talk to him anymore, and may he go unalive in a ditch. But the funny thing is that one of my older sisters still has the wolf blanket that he was going to have me born on before the hospital staff informed him that it would be incinerated as medical waste after. So for a laugh, and mostly because I wanted to make a proof of concept blanket anyways, I wanted to make a blanket for post-op surgery for me. The black and white with primarily gray in between symbolizes the lack of gender and the lack of gender binary that I have as an agender trans mask, while the soft pink of the border represents not wanting to lose my softness and my terror of turning into either of my biological parents. Hades Himbo joined me for part of the stitching. I'm so glad for him and Penelope Calico. They're both in various bits of paperwork as emotional support animals, or ESAs. This is different from a service animal because they're not trained to provide service in any way. They provide emotional comfort and support by being with me. At darker times of my life, knowing they were there has kept me on this planet. Both Hades Himbo and Penelope Calico help by providing pressure, companionship, and tactile comfort. Penelope Calico has added being a heart rate monitor for my postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome to her role, but she wasn't trained for that. She's just deeply opinionated and more than willing to scream her complaints to me. I adore her and I'm grateful for her, but I'm never getting another Calico ever. Think tortitude and orange stubbornness all in one cat. Because of how I was raised and my background, I also use my cats to judge other people. I make very clear boundaries around how my cats are to be treated by people who come into my home, and if those boundaries aren't respected, I know that that person is unlikely to respect any of my own boundaries. The boundaries are pretty simple. The cats don't owe you anything. Don't feel entitled to their space. If they come up to you asking for pets, that is their choice. If you don't want to pet them, you can politely ask me to remove them from your space. Because I knew that I'd be binding this blanket, I wasn't worried about the length, but in order to get this end all one length, I'll use a tight zigzag stitch, almost an applique stitch, to sew 2 lines about 1/4 inch apart down the center of where I want to cut. This stabilizes the woven fabric and prevents it from unraveling, like a serger but less persnickety. For this project, I'm using quilting thread as it's a bit stronger and I trust it more on my old sewing machine. I then take my don't ask how much I paid for these good shears and cut down the ditch that I've sewn out. For those familiar with machine sewing, it's like the opposite of stitching the ditch, or at least that's how my brain makes sense of it. All the fabric I use is from thrift stores as well. I estimated how wide I wanted the binding to be and then ironed it by folding the outer edges into the center and then folding it in half and ironing again. This was the first time I was using this binding method, so I gave myself as much grace as I could muster, reminding myself that this was a proof of concept blanket for my personal use and that it didn't need to be perfect. Then there was so much sewing. So much sewing. As in, I started sewing this at 9 o'clock in the morning, and when I was done sewing, I looked up and realized it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I pinned and sewed, and I'm fully aware that this isn't the proper way to do this, and that any quilters watching are likely yelling at the screen right now. It's moments like this that it makes it very clear that I am a weaver, not a fine quilter or tailor. Yes, I can absolutely hear the quilter's screams, especially with this corner turn. Yeah, I never claimed to be a quilter. I dabbled, but it has been dabbling only. I am a weaver. And after hours and hours of sewing, we have a blanket. Thank you for coming along as I wove a proof of concept blanket. I'm so glad for the odd turn that your path took that brought you here. Thank you for spending time with me at Hawksong Weaving, where we're all a bit warped, and I hope that you have a truly excellent week. This video is coming out on the 16th, and on the 20th, I'm getting the teat yeet, so I will see y'all anonce. And again, I hope you have a good weekend.